Well, hello, everyone. It's Scott Stephenson here. I'm the president and CEO of the Museum of the American Revolution, and I'm glad you've signed in and are following along for this discussion of flags and symbols from the American Revolution. And I'm super excited to be chatting today with my good friend, Virginia Whelan, who is joining us from the Philadelphia suburbs. I'm down at the Museum of the American Revolution at 3rd and Chestnut Streets in Philadelphia. And for about the next 30 minutes, we're going to chat about some really significant original objects from the Revolutionary War, most of which have the common thread going through them that Virginia Whelan has been involved in preserving them, researching them, and getting them ready for a presentation at the museum. So welcome, Virginia.
Welcome. Thanks for having me. This is fun.
You bet. Our history goes back, quite a few years now. In the years before the museum actually was under construction here at 3rd and Chestnut, we had a little nondescript warehouse out near Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, out near Valley.
The secret warehouse.
Secret warehouse, the fortress.
Everybody knew about.
Exactly. Yeah. And so for a good long time, we saw one another almost daily as you worked to conserve and prepare for display the largest and most significant textile in our collection, George Washington's war tent.
That was very memorable. That was a lot of fun, a lot of work.
And you were working with an intern at the time.
Yeah, Joanna Hurd was a pre-program intern with me for 3 years, and she's now in her 3rd year at the Winterthur program of art conservation, but she's majoring in paper, which too bad she didn't go into textiles, but she worked with me and other conservators in order to get into the program.
Yeah, I think we even have an image of you working out in the Fortress of Solitude, which is great. People often ask, well, you're this new museum, where did you get your collection? And we're actually the successor organization for the Valley Forge Historical Society, which was actually first organized around the time of the First World War. And there's an image of you working carefully over that, what really is hundreds of yards of fabric that constitute.
And that's the secret warehouse right there.
That's right. Yeah, I remember those yellow cabinets well. And that's where
we had 12 card tables lined up and covered with Tyvek in order to lay out the tent, but it was so large you can see the fold in the one corner. We had to roll it over a tube in order to get it all on that table.
Yeah. It's interesting where I'm sitting in the museum right now. I'm looking out through some windows of our board room at Independence National Historical Park, and what's now beautiful green trees are standing on the location of a building that back in the early 20th century was where there was a newspaper published that in 1906 first wrote an article. It was an interview with Miss Mary Custis Lee, the daughter of Robert E. Lee and a descendant through her mother of Martha Washington, who actually owned the tent. And it was the acquisition of George Washington's tent in 1909 that launched the formation of what was then the Valley Forge Museum of American History, the Valley Forge Historical Society, and ultimately the Museum of the American Revolution. And actually,
did the flag come in at the same time? Did the George Washington flag come in at the same time?
No. In fact, yeah, just right after the tent was acquired and put on display out at the Washington Memorial Chapel at Valley Forge, someone who knew a collateral descendant from the Washington family who had the Commander-in-Chief standard in the family brought that to the attention of Reverend W. Herbert Burke, who was our founder. And we're actually going to talk about the standard a little bit later in this broadcast because it's an object that was reunited with the tent in 1909, and they've stayed together since then. And it's actually the inspiration for the star pattern that's behind me. But I guess before we get to George Washington's standard, it would be interesting maybe to go back in time a little bit and talk about two other flags that are an important part of the evolution of the symbols and designs of flags. And I'm again thinking back to our one of our first field trips together, Jen. Actually, it was while you were working conserving the tent, and we were planning the galleries for the museum. And here you can see this great shot. This is an image from our virtual museum. So anyone who's tuning in, you can actually go to our website, which is amrevmuseum.org, and click on virtual resources. And we have 360 photography and a wonderful virtual tour of the gallery. So you can literally go in and bring this image up. And this is of a small gallery, Mark and Rosalind Schenkman, who were generous supporters of the museum. And Mark is a member of our board of directors and a historic flag collector himself, was really keen to have this little exhibition come together. And you're seeing two Revolutionary War flags side by side, and we're going to focus on the one on the left, which is called the Monmouth flag because of its descent with an association with the Battle of Monmouth. And it's on loan to the museum from the Monmouth County Historical Association in Freehold, New Jersey. And I remember a couple years before we opened, Jenna, you and I driving over to take a look at the flag, the yellow flag here on the left. And do you remember the excitement of that day?
It was so great to see it right in front of us. It had been stitched down to a large cotton panel, and part of the hoist was, okay, so we should talk about parts of the flag.
Yeah, what's a hoist?
A hoist is where it is hoisted up a flagpole. So it's the end that goes up against the flagpole. The Union Jack that we see here is considered the canton, and then the yellow part of this flag is called the field. So that when we talk about canton, hoist, fly, field, it's the same language for every flag. Gotcha. So the hoist in this one is really interesting. It's a pole sleeve, so a pole would have been inserted within the yellow silk, and at the very top is a buttonhole stitch, a little grommet, and that's where a tassel would have been if it had been when it was on a flagpole. And we're going to also be talking about the Dansey flag, and the Dansey flag is unusual one because it's a Revolutionary War flag, but also it has its original tassels. So keep your eye open for that.
And so it looks like somebody's taking a little bite out of the hoist there in the middle of the flag. You can see on the image on the left, right?
Yep.
Is that
the story behind that is someone had clipped it and put it in a quilt, but we don't know if that's true, but it is left as it is. We did not compensate for that loss. Mostly I had to support the blue silk in the canton. It was very thin and fragile, and I had to dye silk and put it behind it and dye netting and put it on top of it. And this is the netting. It's so sheer. You probably can't even see it. Here I am, right here. Oh,
very gauzy.
So you have to color dye everything to match, and that's not a simple process here. Okay, this is what you have to do. You have to do samples before you get the perfect color match. It's all precision. It's done using an eyedropper, pipette.
And so once you've done that work, you've been able to sort of blend the repair with the original material. So what smooths it out, makes it look more natural.
Yeah, so the idea is from a distance, you can appreciate it aesthetically, it looks whole, but when you get close, you realize it isn't. So you're not trying to fake it or be deceitful. You're just trying to make it aesthetically pleasing at a distance, but up close, there's been conservation work done.
Gotcha. And one of the things I find so amazing about this flag is the design in the red fabric that's forming.
Isn't that fantastic? That's a damask weave, and that's not typically used in flags. That's a furnishing fabric. That you would have found that in a chair. And so the fact that they reused that, repurposed it in the canton, is pretty interesting. The other silks, the white and the blue, are all plain weave silk, and then the yellow is a ribbed silk. But the thing that I don't understand, Scott, is why is this considered an American Revolutionary War flag when there's a British flag in the canton?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's something that has resulted in the confused histories of a number of surviving Revolutionary War flags. There isn't really precise statistics on this, but there may be about 30 to 40 original, kind of Revolutionary era flags or fragments of flags associated with American forces, and a number of those actually do bear this what we would now call the Union, or in the period would have been called a Union, or we now call the Union Jack, is this the symbol, and it combines the red cross, which represents England, as the cross of St. George, and then the diagonal white cross in the background is the cross of St. Andrew, in Scotland, and together they form the Union. Now, in 1801, when Ireland was brought into the United Kingdom, there's a red overstripe over that, outlining the cross of St. Andrew, and that becomes properly the Union Jack. So it's an excellent question. Why would an American flag, we think of the American Revolution, have this British symbol? We have to remember that, hindsight is 2020. So we think of the American Revolution as the culmination of a plan set in foot by the Pilgrims to form an independent United States. But of course, the thing about living in the moment is you don't know how things turn out. So the war, of course, breaks out in 1775, and it's over a year of fighting before the Declaration of Independence. And for much of those 12 months or more, the aim of most of these revolutionaries was not to declare independence, but to restore traditional rights as Englishmen. And so
they didn't want to be separate. They wanted to be considered equal, right. Still be British citizens, but be under the crown, but equal.
And so the way you signal your loyalty is having that symbol. They described their dispute was with Parliament or with bad ministers who were advising the king the wrong way, but constantly saying that we're loyal to King George III, and that's what that symbol on those flags means, is that we are still loyal British subjects. So what I love about this flag is that it's confused so many generations of Americans. So it's called the Monmouth flag, and there was a story, it descended actually in a family in Pennsylvania. And in the 19th century, early 20th century, the feeling was, well, if there's a British symbol, it must be a British flag. So there was a story that grew up that this was actually a captured British flag, that was captured during the Battle of Monmouth. And then when it was pointed out that it wasn't actually the right configuration for a British regimental flag, because the British Army is highly standardized in a lot of their construction details, well, maybe it was actually made in America, but for the British Army. The simpler explanation is that it is what's often known as an associator flag. So these are the volunteer militias that are formed in all of the colonies, later states, early in the war. And there are a number of flags that have survived that all have this common feature. In fact, there's another flag out in Bedford County, Pennsylvania, in a small museum at Fort Bedford, where the field, so what's yellow on this flag is red, and it's composed entirely of that same red damask. They may well have come from the same shop, maybe in a place like Philadelphia.
What I love about this canton is that it would have been an unspoken language. Everybody would have understood who these people were at the time. And I love that symbolism and how the flags represent a feeling, an allegiance, philosophy. And if we look at the Dansey flag, this might be a good time to transition to that one, which is a Delaware flag. It has a different canton, but it also would have been recognizable. Now see, here you can see the tassels. You see the original tassels on this flag? That's
this is flag you also know very well, right?
I do. I conserve this one too. So this one, I conserved this just recently for your exhibit on the Irish Revolution that was down at the Museum of the American Revolution that just closed right before COVID.
We just closed this exhibit right before we had to close because of the COVID. It was called Cost of Revolution. And this is a flag that's owned by the Delaware Historical Society down in Wilmington, Delaware. David Young, who's their director, was wonderful and supportive in allowing us to borrow this flag. We were able to get you, Jenna, to do some conservation on it, to prepare it for display. And it's wonderful to me because it shows that transition, and we'll talk about those details in a second, but just from a historical point of view, if you can see in this image the oval portrait of the man in the red coat that's kind of on the left side there, that is a portrait of William Dansey, who was an officer in the British Army, part of the forces that invaded Pennsylvania or liberated Pennsylvania, depending upon your perspective. And the Delaware Historical Society in the 1920s acquired the flag and a series of letters from William Dansey to his mother written during the Revolutionary War. So this is actually a trophy, and he describes capturing it from the baggage of a militia officer from Newcastle County, Delaware, not far from Wilmington, where it resides today. And it was retained as a kind of war trophy in England for nearly 2 centuries. And it's a great sort of step from that Monmouth flag with the Union. Now you're seeing we're after the Declaration of Independence, but still.
Right back. I got to turn my clock off.
Oh. The grandfather clock. Yeah, this is a wonderful way to show, as Americans are searching for what will the symbol be for the new United States, you tend to look for 13 of something, and here's 13 red and white alternating stripes. So what did you observe when you got deep into this and we're really looking closely?
Well, what's interesting is that it looks like it's a gold tone now. And that's because it's been exposed to light over time and the silk has faded. It is constructed of 2 pieces of silk, horizontal pieces of silk, and it's actually dark green, which what I understand, and I don't know military uniforms much, but I understand that the Delaware militia did use green as their coat color. Would that be true?
I do not know the answer to that.
Okay, maybe I made that up totally. But the red and white stripes, the 13 red and white stripes are there in the canton, and we have the tassels. But if you look on the back of the flag, which I was able to do when I was conserving it, and within the pole sleeve, some of the stitches are lost, you can see the dark green. So the one thing that with textiles is you want to display them because they're so beautiful and you're proud of them, but they are so fragile. Now this one is in good condition, although it's faded, so that those red and white stripes now look pink and white, but it would have been a deep red. Or redder, I don't want to say deep red. But what is interesting about this flag is it has a self fringe. So if you look at the fringe side, the fly end, they're little.
That's on the right side, yeah.
On the right side, opposite the hoist, so the fly end. All that fringe is just the silk being teased out. They would have taken out some of the warps and just allowed it to be a self fringe.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah, it's incredible to stand in the presence of this flag. It's so complete, obviously faded, but to have the original tassels there, and then to know the history that it witnessed. One
other interesting thing to note that's similar across all these flags is the construction, the way it's constructed. That the way that they seamed 2 pieces of silk together would be a flat fell. So it's actually 2 pieces of silk folded over, and there are 4 edges sewn with 2 lines. So they all have that. They utilize the selvage edge, which is the side on a loom. When you're weaving, it goes back and forth, and the edges are just returned, and so there's no roughness to it. It doesn't fray. So they utilize the fabric, the construction of the fabric within the flag, and the way that you don't have to hem a selvage, but you do have to hem raw edges. And so that if we go to the next flag, which you're talking about, which is You're my favorite. I can't tell you how many places I have this flag. I have a replica hanging outside my house. So this is George Washington's flag. And so it's from a single piece of blue silk. The hoist edge has 3 grommets stitched into it so that it would have been poked. Oh, I thought I turned my clock off.
You were good.
So it has 3
ambiance
grommets in the fly end where it would have been attached to a pole that way. And so this one is so fragile that when I was working on it, I nearly fainted because if you breathed on it, it would flutter. It's as thin as one piece of a Kleenex. It's so fragile that I was actually very strict. And I told Scott, this flag can come out once a year. That's it. You cannot over display it because it has been damaged by exposure to light over time.
Yeah, we were so, this was the flag I was referencing earlier in 1909 when the marquee tent, Washington's war tent, was first placed on display. Reverend Burke was leading a tour around and someone on the tour group said, I know where the flag is that goes with that tent. And he subsequently introduced to this other kind of branch of the family that were descendants of Washington's nephews through his sister. And they had preserved this flag as the commander-in-chief's standard or headquarters flag. And it was with the family story that this had flown at Washington's headquarters to signal his presence in the field. And it's of a size that's often referred to as a standard. It's hard because you don't have anything for size.
Scale, right.
But it's considerably smaller. It's a size that you would normally mount on a pole, say, to carry by mounted troops or to fly outside Washington's marquee. The other thing I find interesting about it, it generated a lot of excitement and a lot of controversy for about a century that was finally solved by you, Jenna, because the question had always been, is this a canton of a stars and stripes? Is this part of just a larger American flag that somebody put out, or is it, a whole object in and of itself? And what did you find when you got into studying that tissue, paper thin material?
Well, one part of being a conservator is that you're actually a detective and that you're looking for evidence. You don't make things up. You have to find the textile, or the object has to tell you the story. So that when I was investigating this, the hoist edge, which is where it's on the pole, is wrapped around a piece of linen. And the fly end is the mystery, because that would have been stitched into the field. However, Scott did you did some detective work also, and you found a photograph of this flag taken in 1920, and there was a thin hem, you could see it along the fly end, and so that hem shows that it was never intended to be within another flag. It is a separate and complete flag in itself. Somewhere between 1920 and whoever knows when the next time someone really looked, that hem is gone now, but we do have photographic evidence that it was there. The top and the bottom are the selvage edges, and they have no evidence of stitch marks. We have 3 grommet holes in the hoist, which means it would have been held up by that edge on a pole. And we had a hem on the fly end so that it is complete. So it was never meant to be, or never was, a canton.
Yeah, we're so grateful. You see at the bottom of the image on the screen, the note that we were able to conserve and preserve this flag with a grant from the Pennsylvania Society of Sons of the Revolution and its color guard. And this is a venerable heritage organization, very strong here in Philadelphia. These are descendants of people who served in the Continental Army and the American forces during the Revolutionary War, and are committed to public education and the preservation of objects. They've had a long association with our collection and our predecessor organization going back at least to the 1950s and 60s. And so we're really grateful for them making it possible, even though the flag can only be brought up, as I say, it's a matter of negotiation between Jenna and I about how often it can be brought out, because light is, all light is damaging, of course. We last had this on this.
So there's another debate we have, Scott.
Oh my, here we go.
The argument is, what color was it originally? Now, we know that there are the six-pointed stars, which are really fantastic. I call them dancing stars. And you can see behind you there, it became the logo for the museum. So that both of them, the blue silk and the white are, the blue and the white are both silk. But Scott, let me just paraphrase what you think. You feel that it should be a deep blue. And I think it should be more of a light blue, a sky blue. And we, during the process of my conserving it, we did send a sample of it to the analytical lab up at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts.
Yep.
They found that it was indigo. So indigo can be many colors. It can be the deep color blue behind you, but as the dye exhausts in the vat, it can become a lighter blue. And so my theory that this is closer. It's not meant to be a dark blue. Mm-hmm. I think it's meant to be that that color blue that was in his sash that you had on display from Harvard University. Mm-hmm. It's the blue that would be in the Society of the Cincinnati. Their badges is that light blue. But so we don't agree on everything, but we're still friends.
We're still friends, exactly. But no, this is, it's obviously a fantastic object. If many of our viewers will probably, if you're buffs, you'll be familiar with a World War II poster that was done, and it's an image was done in 1943, I believe, and it was an image of Washington's bedraggled troops at Forge, and then a group of GIs marching past, and it said, "Americans will always fight for liberty." And you see flying over those troops an image of Washington's standard. And this painting was done by an artist named Bernard Perlin, who actually, he just passed away a few years ago, but I managed to track him down in Connecticut just the last few years of his life, and we corresponded. And I asked him, that George Washington's flag was not incredibly well known by the 1940s. It hadn't really been published anywhere. And I just was curious, how did you settle on that design? Unfortunately, he said he was handed a folder of research. He actually had an incredibly clear memory. He actually remembered the names of all the soldiers he used as models in doing that poster. But he said he had been handed a sheaf of research documents. But again, it's an image that is really stuck in a lot of people's minds. It reminds me of the generations since the Revolutionary War, of course, who have been part of keeping the Republic alive, defending our liberties, and all feel a connection back to this founding era. I actually grew up in Pittsburgh, Western Pennsylvania, and my next door neighbor had been a Marine at Iwo Jima. And actually, when I think about like my interest in flags, I remember him talking when I was probably in middle school, talking about seeing as a soldier on the ground in the black sand of Iwo Jima, looking up at Mount Suribachi and seeing that American flag flying there. That's maybe the first time I thought about the power of these kinds of objects. And of course, we don't have as much eyewitness testimony from Revolutionary War soldiers about how they felt seeing these objects that Jenna, you've had a chance to hold and conserve, and that our visitors get to see. But I'm curious, as maybe as the last question, all of these flags that we've looked at, it's quite likely that some, maybe all of them, were made within a few blocks of where I'm sitting in Philadelphia. We've all heard of Betsy Ross, of course, but also Rebecca Flower Young. This was a neighborhood filled with women artisans who were doing this kind of work. work. And I'm just curious, as a textile conservator, someone who sews, you've had a hand. What, as a woman, interested in history, what's your kind of emotional response been to being able to handle so many of these original objects?
Well, as you're working, you have to be very focused on the object, but you do get a sense of the people behind the textiles, and that's the social history, the cultural connection, the historical connection is what I really enjoy. And what's been and continues to be one of the best parts of working with everybody at the museum on their textiles is that you guys do all the research and you tell me about it, because usually I have to do the research and find it out, and it takes time, but you enjoy it. But you always do your curators and historians do the deep dive into documents and historical archives, and then you give me the background. But it's the people, it's a connection of a person actually sitting where I am sitting and making the object, and you wonder what they were doing and what their life was like and who was in their life and what were their worries and what were their joys. So it's a connection to the people that I enjoy.
Fantastic. Well, we can disagree about colors, but I think we agree about the power of the past and the power of objects.
The power of objects, that's it.
Yeah. So, gosh, the time has sure flown by. There's a great shot of the Museum of the American Revolution, the home of all these objects that we've been talking about. We certainly cannot wait to welcome people back into the museum. But of course, while we're all quarantined, while my hair grows longer than it normally is, you can, as I mentioned at the top of the show, our virtual museum is a great way to dive in and explore the galleries. You can actually find images of some of these flags there as you go through the galleries. And Jenna, I can't wait to see you in person again. And
it's been so long. Oh.
It's terrible.
Well, I hope you're gathering some good textiles for me to work on. You always have the best in that collection. There's always a story.
Wonderful. Well,
thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Good. Love it. See you soon.
See ya.